Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining this session today. I'm really excited to have an interesting conversation, hopefully, with all of you. So my name is Kenzie Gordon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here today on behalf of Sexual Assault Voices of Edmonton. So I'll tell you a little bit about SAVE, the organization, in a minute. But just to contextualize a little bit, like who I am, why I'm here. So as I mentioned, I'm a board member with SAVE. I'm also a social worker with a background in gender-based violence prevention. I'm currently working on a graduate degree at the University of Alberta, where I study representations of gender-based violence in video games. And I'm just really looking forward to having an interesting conversation with you about the ways that we can kind of reframe our approaches to sexual violence and carcerality. Because I think this has been something that a lot of us at SAVE in particular have been kind of learning through in the last few years. And it really leads to some interesting conversations in this space and this work. So I'll say right off the top, the reason that I have new in quotations in the title here is that this is like 99% the work of other people, almost 100% the work of other people. And in particular, it's the work of women and queer activists, people of color who have been doing this work for decades. So this is work that is intrinsically connected to broader movements of anti-colonial liberation, justice. So just to note that, nothing that we're presenting here is really our original idea. This is the work of other people that we're kind of trying to bring into our own space here. So just to put that up front. So for a little background on SAVE, it is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2013 through a coalition of Edmonton nonprofits that worked in the sexual violence prevention sector and the Edmonton Police Service. And it was focused on public education campaigns that emphasized perpetrator accountability rather than the kind of messages we often used to see more than we do now about how people could protect themselves from assault, right? Like the cover your drink kind of messaging, which shifts responsibility, of course, away from the people who are actually committing violence. So we ran kind of two big public information campaigns. One was Don't Be That Guy, which had multiple phases, which received a lot of international news coverage, is still used by organizations around the world. And then a subsequent campaign called #DeleteIt, which was about non-consensual sharing of intimate images, like over text messaging and that kind of thing. But after a few years, SAVE's focus began to kind of shift to more like community grounded perspectives. And our interests diverged from the Edmonton Police Service, from EPS, and they ceased to be involved in the organization. And then we took a very hard turn a few years later. But just for context, we didn't kind of go from like working with EPS to defund the police in like one step. There was kind of a process there. But SAVE is now run by a volunteer board of community members, most of whom work or volunteer in sexual violence prevention in some capacity in Edmonton, as well as survivors and advocates. So that's us at SAVE. And kind of what brought us to this work, these conversations was, in 2020, of course, we saw a big resurgence in the calls for defund the police, which had been a movement for a long time before that. But as the Black Lives Matter movement gained prominence following the murder of George Floyd in the United States, as we watched this situation unfold, we kind of started to notice a pattern in conversations about defunding the police, which went along the lines of, if we defund the police, who will stop the rapists, right? We were hearing a lot of versions of this question. And it was interesting to us because as sexual violence advocates and survivor, we know really well that the police don't stop sexual violence. That is not what they are designed to do. And as we'll talk about in a moment, the criminal justice system has a very complicated relationship to sexual violence and often actually compounds the trauma of people who've experienced violence when they interact with this system. So we thought that this was maybe a bit of a straw man argument that was being used. And we also noted that a lot of sexual violence organizations that offer services to survivors and work in the court system have a pretty limited ability to critique those systems because their clients need to interact with those systems, right? That is the method for justice that's currently available. And we kind of thought, because we don't have that client service angle, we don't serve clients directly, and we don't have any funding that can get impacted by people getting mad at us, we decided that we could kind of maybe try and add something to this conversation, which began a really long process for us of learning about the relationships between carceral systems, sexual violence, and issues like white supremacy and colonialism. So for us, this led to the creation of several interconnected projects, which includes a zine about community safety that you can access on our website. And I will have a QR code at the end of the presentation where you can access my slides, and then all of these links will be clickable. So if you want any of that, that will be available at the end. So our zine is on our website about kind of community safety alternatives in Edmonton. And it also led to the founding of the Edmonton Police Violence Archive, or the YEG Police Violence Archive, which is a community archiving project that's trying to collect accounts of police violence and police responses to sexual violence in our community, to kind of give us a capacity to even understand what is happening in our community. What does this look like? So I won't be talking too much in depth about these projects today, but if you'd like to ask questions about them at the end, I'm happy to discuss further because they're near and dear to us. So in our conversations today, we're going to be drawing on a lot of theory and practice that has emerged from abolitionist movements, which is the movement to essentially get rid of the police and prison systems as we currently understand them. And especially those movements led by women and queer people of color, both in the West, in Canada, in the United States, and Europe, and around the world. But I want to contextualize that even if you don't believe that abolishing the police is the way to go, and there's lots of legitimate reasons that people have that standpoint, I think that there's a lot of value for us in considering just what kind of alternatives can we imagine if we don't have to proceed from the basis of this very specific system, right? So if we just imagine this isn't where we have to start, then what is possible? What is available to us, right? So you can believe that there is a role for policing in our response to sexual violence, but we can still consider what alternatives might do a better job in certain situations, right? So personally, I come from this kind of abolitionist standpoint, and I think it's important to understand the history of policing and carcerality in the context of sexual violence, because it helps us understand kind of the problematics in how we think about sexual violence, like conceptually, more than just how we respond to it, like logistically in our systems. So yeah, I just kind of want to put that out there. And, you know, I have worked in the domestic and sexual violence sector. I know that there's lots of things that we learn about how the dynamics of these things work, how systems need to respond. And it can be difficult to hear something different. It's been a challenge and a journey for all of us to think through. But I think important is, like, we know that everyone who comes to this work is trying to do right by the people they're serving, right? So there is no approach that is wrong. And we're not here to say that a certain approach is wrong, but rather to think about what else is possible. So that's kind of the perspective we're coming from here. So I really love this quote from Mariam Kaba, whose quotes will be sprinkled throughout this presentation, that we're not centering the question, like, what happens if we get rid of the police, but rather what happens if we try something different, right? What other possibilities are available to us? So yes, and with that note, Renee's comment has reminded me to remind you that if you have questions at any point, feel free to pop things in the chat. I'm happy to not save them to the end, and I will have a couple of opportunities where I have questions that I'd like to throw back to you that I'd like to hear from you from. But definitely feel like free to be interactive. I don't want to save it all to the end because we're working through a couple of different kind of complex ideas here, right? Okay, so that being said, I think an important starting place in this conversation is the history of policing, because it's an institution that's so naturalized to us that we tend to think of it as something that's been around for a really long time, right? That it's kind of like human societies will always have something like this. The reality is policing as we know it today is a relatively modern invention, although of course there were organizations like Night Watches in the UK, and obviously many other parts of the world have had guards or some kind of like enforcement body of the state in the 1600s and earlier. The first organized police-like forces that were intended to enforce state power, as we would kind of recognize it today, were the slave patrols that emerged in the Carolinas in the 1700s. So these were essentially state-sanctioned militias that were empowered to recapture escaped slaves and to quash kind of any nascent slave uprisings. And eventually these kind of became codified as legitimate enforcement arms of the government, right? So obviously these bodies are already very entrenched in a racialized social order that's trying to reinforce like the power of whiteness. And that's of course interwoven with economic forces because Black people are property in this framework. So it's kind of enforcing these property rights as well. In the late 1800s in Canada, or what would become Canada, John A. Macdonald instituted the RCMP, which was then the Northwest Mounted Police, to kind of help extend the power of the state into the West, right? Which was like kind of an evolving project. And one of the primary ways that what would become the RCMP did that was enforcing the Indian Act, which often involved protecting European settlers from Indigenous peoples' perceived encroachment onto their land, kind of the danger that just like free groups of Indigenous people moving around the territory posed to this kind of European imaginary of control. So often the form that this took was pushing Indigenous people onto the reserve system, right? It was a big role of the RCMP in enforcing this. And later, of course, enforcing residential school attendance was a really big component of what the RCMP was there for, and to arrest parents who resisted their children being apprehended. So from these foundations, it's pretty easy to see that the way that policing has operated for a long time been about restricting the movement and freedom of particular people, right? Specifically people of color who need to be controlled to allow the establishment of like a government order that's dominated by white people. So we can see that these legacies continue today in a lot of like subtle and also not very subtle ways. So we know that there are grossly disproportionate rates of incarceration for Indigenous people in particular. And the way other branches of the criminal justice system are kind of intersect with this. So the child welfare system, for example, which evolved fairly directly out of the enforcement of residential schools, disproportionately punishes people of color, right? And Indigenous people in particular are much more likely to kind of come into contact and have negative experiences with the child welfare system. So that's kind of the legacy of policing. On the other side of things, of course, is the way that the legal systems in the West have traditionally responded to sexual violence. So for many centuries, sexual violence was considered a property crime, right? This was like stealing the virtue or the right of sexual access, in particular to a woman's body, from the man that she belonged to. So that would be her father or her husband. And this is evident in kind of the wide array of laws that are really common around the world, in which one possible remedy for sexual assault was like paying the man that you stole from, or marrying the victim if they were unmarried, right? Then the property issue is sorted. This is not a problem anymore. So it's not so much a question about the harm to the person, but rather like a stealing of a resource that belongs to somebody, right? So feminist historian Estelle Friedman suggests that female chastity for a long time was considered more a matter of like family and national honor than an aspect of women's own self-determination to their bodies. And thus the need for like a state apparatus to defend that honor was a driving force between sexual assault laws. So if we look, for example, about how the United States had this very big fear in like the white legal imaginary about African-American men assaulting white women. This was like kind of a multi-pronged attack on the ideology of the state, right? That like white women are property that should belong to white men, that this is like an act of an act of independence or like agency by Black men that like violates the social order, kind of breaks a lot of the rules of the system as regards race and property and control over women. And so we saw a lot of the laws that kind of emerged in the States around these times as how do we deal with like the threat to women's virtue that is posed by this, and by extension, the threat to like the ideology of the state, which kind of has put white women as like the thing it is protecting, right? Of course, this has changed with the women's movement in the latter half of the 20th century. Some very determined efforts have led to kind of a shift in perspective on sexual violence as now seen as a form of interpersonal violence rather than property crime for the most part. And the changing of laws has reflected that. But one effect of that shift that's really interesting, I think, is that sexual violence ceases to be seen as a community problem, right? For everything that was wrong with it before, it wasn't something that only happened to one person. It was something that happened to their community, and it happened to their family. And it was kind of considered a wider problematic. And when we shift this view of sexual violence as an interpersonal harm, it becomes something that only happens between two people, and it's less the problem of the community, right? Addition to that, because we have now that we kind of work in the court system, this need to meet an evidentiary standard. We need to be able to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. We have to be able to draw lines around what constitutes sexual violence and what does not, right? Which is reflected in our evolving language around coercion in our legal system, for example, where originally these laws didn't really have any space for coercion. It imagined violent assaults as the only kind of assault that was possible, but gradually we've kind of come to understand, now that we have affirmative consent laws, that it's not just not saying no, but you need to like actively be saying yes. Similarly, like marital rape is a fairly recent addition to our legal system, where for a very long time a husband could not rape his wife legally because he owned access to her. So we have seen kind of these boundaries shift over time, but because sexual violence needs to fit into like the way that the court system needs things to be black and white, a set of boundary conditions rise up around what constitutes it. A set of punishments are established, right? What is an appropriate consequence if we decide, yes, this act has been committed? And the responsibility for preventing sexual violence shifts to individuals because it's an individual problem. This is not the responsibility of the community anymore. So we do see like things like the movement for bystander intervention, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, is kind of a way that that responsibility has started to shift back to community. But especially if we think about how sexual violence was kind of conceptualized in the 90s and the early 2000s, it's really an individualized problem now, right? That it just belongs to the people that it happens to. So the combination of the history of our policing system and the history of how our system has thought about sexual violence all comes to kind of this point where it tells us that our legal systems and their enforcement bodies are always about control, right? So whether it's control over certain kinds of people and what kind of autonomy they exercise in the system, or over specific bodies and the ways the rights of those bodies are assigned to different people. And specifically, it's always been about control over the most marginalized people in our societies, right? In terms of race, in terms of gender, on a number of variables. And so this is kind of the grounding that people who argue that there's not really like a possibility for reform in policing come from, is that if the foundation of the system is the repression and control of particular groups of people, then no amount of reform of that system is going to change how it fundamentally understands its role, right? But I think like whether or not you kind of accept that, it's hard to not see that the carceral approach is one that is founded in punishment, right? That it is about applying consequences to someone and punishing them for their action, which is often a form of violence, especially as we see it enacted, that exercising violence is a big part of how this system works. Even if we think about, being in prison is experiencing restraint, that is a form of violence against someone's body. And I think if we kind of look then about the efficacy of this system and like, where does it lead us when we think about as a solution for sexual violence, what does this do for us? It's not great, right? So the estimates vary because of course we don't know the number of sexual assaults that are perpetrated. We kind of have to make estimates off of how many are reported. In a 2012 research study estimate in Canada, 0.3% of all assaults successfully make it through prosecution to a conviction, right? Which is not a great number. And that's like the ideal outcome. Okay, so 0.3% are reaching this ideal outcome of this consequence. And this is in Canada, a country that is hailed by sexual violence advocates as having relatively progressive and inclusive sexual assault laws, right? We have one of the best sets of sexual assault laws in the world. And we are hitting this 0.3% conviction rate, right? And yes, Renee, as you point out, the racialized and identity dynamics around that the 0.3% are not going to be the most marginalized people that are reaching those outcomes, right? It's going to be people who kind of fit the model of how the system expects survivors of sexual violence to present, expects these scenarios to unfold. So obviously that's not great. A couple of other consequences that we kind of see of this like law and order approach to sexual violence is, of course, that groups of victims, survivors who are marginalized, so people who are undocumented, for example, sex workers, are afraid to access supports or make reports of sexual violence because the perceived risks are greater than the perceived gains, right? So you could be deported, you could be brought into contact with children's services, you might face arrest or other legal consequences. That is not worth the 0.3% chance of a conviction, right? The need to meet these high evidentiary standards and narratives about sexual violence, what is the correct way for sexual violence to unfold, means that only a very small subset of survivors have access to what is considered justice in our system. And the antagonistic structure of the justice system means that the court process itself can be as, if not more, traumatic than the violence. So a couple of recent examples, if we look at the Amber Heard case, the woman who was abused by Johnny Depp, where she was analyzed from every angle about whether she presented as a perfect victim, right? And whether her narrative held up. The trauma of going through that court case, I'm sure was, very substantial, and probably not worth it from her perspective. We can also think about Cindy Gladue, who was an Indigenous woman who's died in the course of her assault. And in the subsequent trial of the man who assaulted her, they brought like a cast of her vagina in court to talk about the injuries. That is an extremely dehumanizing act, right? And was really widely criticized. But it's fairly representative of the way that survivors have to be dehumanized in the pursuit of justice, right? Submitting yourself to this system means you surrender control over what the narrative of what has happened to you is going to be, and you surrender any kind of autonomy in deciding what the outcomes are going to be, right? Other consequences, of course, the funding goes into policing and prisons, which are very expensive systems to run, rather than social programs and shelters, which are less expensive and one could argue have more significant impacts on the community. Prisons do nothing to reduce the rates of violence, right? There are very limited programs available in prisons for people who commit these forms of violence. There's not very much evidence that it reduces recidivism of any kind. And of course, violence also takes place in prison, right? Sexual violence in prison is quite endemic. So that just kind of amplifies that harm. And I think, like, thinking more broadly, the reliance on the criminal justice system reduces our community's abilities to organize themselves around alternatives, right? So if I'm a member of a community and we decide that we don't like the way that certain kinds of sexual violence cases are being handled in our community, we're going to have to fight to take any degree of control over that response away from the legal system in the first place, right? So even to receive a report and decide how to proceed with that, we're going to have to really struggle. Oh, you put a note, it was not a cast, it was her preserved vagina. That's right. Thank you. Yes, even more horrifying. Yeah, so our ability to organize around alternatives is really limited, right? Because we have to then fight for space to even talk about these things. And in many cases, try and like divert people from the funneling into the court system that kind of ensues from this being like the base approach that we take. So that brings me to kind of the question of intersectionality and alternatives. So I'm sure we're all familiar with intersectionality. It's kind of a buzzword now. It refers to the unique and overlapping spheres of identity that structure how an individual experiences the world, and most critically, how people experience forms of oppression, right? Now, it's not a coincidence that the term intersectionality was coined by a legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, specifically in reference to the experiences of Black women survivors of sexual and domestic violence interacting with the court system. So since it became a buzzword, we tend to kind of sometimes think of intersectionality as like a descriptors for an individual's experience, right? she's Asian and disabled. That's her like intersectional position. But intersectionality is also about how systems respond to people and how systems of oppression work on people based on their identities and where they sit kind of in those spaces, right? And that's why so much of the anti-carceral work around sexual violence arises from communities of color, because there's a recognition that these institutions are kind of incapable of holding those two truths at the same time for marginalized people, right? In most scenarios, it can kind of hold one group's values, if any marginalized group's values, but very rarely can it kind of hold them together, right? And when we think about like what harms a carceral logic does, one of the challenges in this model is, of course, that it's built on this idea of like the perfect assault, right? Which is the stranger in the bushes that jumps out, the survivor screams no, the assault happens. There's no muddy questions about the existing relationships between the parties. We don't have to wonder what was said. This is kind of like the ideal. We know the reality is the majority of sexual assaults happen in the context of pre-existing relationships, right? Often dating or partnered relationships. And we know that especially when assault takes place in the context of an intimate relationship, what survivors often want is not punishment or retribution, but for the person to get help and to change. And the person is often their partner, right? Because our court system is built on an adversarial model, it's very difficult to kind of move to that outcome, right? So if we think about even a couple who is amicably divorcing and trying to split child custody, the way the court system works will force them into a confrontational approach, right? You will have to do a lot of workarounds in the system not to end up in a room arguing, because that is what the court system is designed to be, is people in a room arguing. And the distance of this divide is really acute for communities, for example, communities of color, who kind of have to choose between bad outcomes, right? So they face stricter sentencing and a more aggressive version of the legal system. And they have to choose what group they're going to be loyal to. So when Kimberly Crenshaw introduced intersectionality, it was in the context of this idea that Black women who were going to enter the court system to face their abuser had to choose between loyalty to their community, protecting Black men, trying to refute the notion that Black men were inherently abusive, that their communities were inherently violent and abusive. And if you go to the court system, you're going to feel like you are promoting that belief, right? But on the other side, loyalty to their gender, protecting women, protecting themselves and others from a person who is behaving in an abusive way. And so the system kind of forces people to choose a path between those two places, right? So intersectionality can't really exist in this space for them. And so the need for change in the carceral model comes from this idea that we need to create systems that don't help us along one axis of identity while hurting us along another one. And for not feeding into this approach that there have to be winners and losers, right? Because coming out of an assault case with someone who is the loser doesn't do anything for the communities. It usually doesn't do anything to heal the individuals involved, right? So this quote is from Insight, which is an amazing organization that kind of works at this intersection of violence, again, gender-based violence and abolition, and kind of this call for us to create systems that repair harm without creating different forms of harm, right? So if we can recognize that involvement with the legal system in any form is going to be a form of violence for people, then it becomes clear that if we want to shift our culture of violence, we need a solution that is not grounded in violence, right? That's kind of like the fundamental basis of this approach. So that's kind of my primer on carceral logics. And now I kind of want to take a pause and kind of talk about our experiences of carceral logics in our own systems and our own work in the systems that you interface with. Because I think there's lots of like different ways that these manifest, and I'm interested to hear what people's experiences are. So my first question for you, and anybody can just kind of jump in, is what examples of these like logics of carcerality, these logics of punishment have you encountered in your own work or experiences? And like what impact did that have on the outcomes, on the opportunities that were available, those kinds of things? So I'm now going to probably do a terrible job of the technology, but if anyone wants to use the voice function or pop in the chat. Thanks, Renee. I'm a social worker, so I can sit in awkward silence.
Well, I'll comment. You were making me think of one, because I think as women, I don't think we can go through our lives almost nowadays without some sort of form of sexual violence. And mine started at a very young age. Like at my first job when I was 16, I got sexually assaulted in the store where I worked, and the employment agency did do it. But I was really lucky to have a mother that was really like hardcore, like stand up for justice. And like we went through the whole court system, we went through all that. But when I reflect on that and I think of all the things that you talked about, Kenzie, I just think I was so able to go through it, and I was supported, and it wasn't even an extreme case. And I just, when I think about just the process of it, and how trying and how hard and how traumatic it is for people to go through that. But then, after that experience, I had another one. You get raped, and you don't do anything about it. Like you don't do anything about it. And it's just, that pyramid for me was just like mind blowing, because I can think about even in college, like me and all my friends, we were all raped. None of us reported ever. It's just like, so wow. Anyway, you've been blowing my mind a little bit today. Thank you for sharing all this.
It is a terrifying reality too. One thing I can think of is with digital media, a lot of younger people, especially, they are, I guess, coerced. Like it's among peers too. Like sometimes I had seen some just being coerced to send explicit pictures, and then they were leaked, and the person who was exploited gets in trouble. Like in their on their records for creating child pornography, for instance, when they were the one who was exploited, and they don't really get justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Renee. And yes, like there are so many of these things because someone has to get in trouble, right? When these things get brought to the fore, that yeah, maybe the person who gets in trouble is not necessarily the person who we think should be getting in trouble. I also think we see so many cases where people do not want to say anything because they don't want the person to get in trouble, right? They just want, they want a consequence. They want the person to learn and to not do it again, but they don't want them to be arrested for sharing child porn, right? It's probably like another 16-year-old that they were flirting with or something. So yeah, because the consequences are so severe, often people are afraid to take that step into the system, right? Because it's so intense. Anything else anyone else wants to jump in with before I give you another question? Oh my gosh, dating police. Yes. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides to wake back up. So I guess this is another question I can pose, but we can also move on if no one kind of jumped. Yeah, absolutely, Simone, your point. So many people who commit sexual violence have been victimized, that it's cyclical, right? And kind of we get trained into these patterns of behavior that no resources are available to break, right? Because it's just there to punish the person who did it, not to change things for how anybody thinks about how it functions, right? So yeah, I have this other question here about how the centralization of criminal justice frameworks limits our opportunities elsewhere. If anyone has thoughts top of mind for that, we can chat about it, or we can kind of move on and circle back. But what alternatives have you maybe seen that get pushed aside because the funding is not available there, because that's not how it works? The criminal justice system is how you respond to these things. Yeah, restorative justice circles. And we'll talk a little bit about restorative justice later on. But it really has to elbow its way in there, right? And yes, access to legal support is absolutely so difficult. I can't even quantify how many hours I've spent sitting with clients in the legal aid office only to be told that, oh, actually, like, we don't do that kind of thing. Or you make $100 too much to qualify. Yes, if you're on ACE, you're over the threshold of support for legal aid. So yeah, kind of the ways that forcing everything to function in this framework and in this system that it is in itself so inherently flawed really limits our opportunities, right? Yes, not dealing with the underlying circumstances, 100%. Okay, we'll kind of circle back to these things because I think they feed into what's coming next. Yes, you have to make yourself become evidence. And that kind of comes back to that note about the boundary conditions, right? That like something has to be sexual violence or not be sexual violence. And you need to make that differentiation before anybody else can even make that differentiation, right? And we will actually be talking a little bit about some really interesting ways to reframe that momentarily. But I guess on a more positive note, we can kind of start talking about what new frameworks can look like, right? What possibilities kind of open up to us if we kind of step a little bit beyond this carceral model. So there are a lot of different like frameworks and approaches for alternative ways to approach this that are not grounded in carcerality. But at the core of almost all of them is the same concept, which is accountability, right? There is an argument to be made that our current system has very little space for accountability. That is, space for the acknowledgement of the harms that one has done and a commitment to change and do better. So typically our like best case scenario is that a survivor makes a report of sexual violence. They believed by all the professionals that they encounter. Sufficient evidence is gathered to meet a legal evidentiary standard. The case goes to court. The survivor hopefully doesn't have their entire sexual history dragged before the courtroom to discredit them. The person who committed the assault is convicted, and they spend time in jail. None of these steps are concerned with the person who committed the assault taking responsibility for their actions and taking steps to repair the harm. And most survivors don't see jail time as an ideal outcome for justice, right? And even if someone does try to take accountability, there are punitive consequences for that, right? So in our legal system, taking accountability is pleading guilty. You do that with the knowledge that you will then probably face some kind of consequence that you can most likely stave off if you don't take accountability, right? Because only 0.3% of all cases are going to get convicted. So the system in some ways discourages people from taking accountability for their actions. But if we kind of think about an alternative system that's grounded in accountability, there's a couple of different levels that we can think about accountability happening in, right? So individual accountability for sexual violence, of course, looks like someone learning about why their actions were harmful, recognizing the impact that those actions have had, and taking steps to address what they've done and change themselves so they don't do it again in the future, right? So a beautiful example of this approach is the Circle of Safety program that's offered by Aboriginal Counseling Services in Edmonton, which is about healing and learning to recognize the dynamics of violence with an emphasis on positive relationships and parenting. So the really beautiful thing about this program is it has a wraparound approach, right? It's kind of in a gender binary, but there's a group for men, a group for women, and a group for children who have been exposed to domestic violence in this case that all run concurrently. And because it's designed to meet the needs of a particular community, it can also draw on culturally specific wisdom, and it can bring people into a sphere of supportive community that's oriented towards healing and change, right? So no part of this system is about punishment, but it is about accountability. It's about people learning to recognize the harms of what they've done. On the other side, people kind of working through the consequences of those harms and what it means to them to have experienced that, all with like an orientation towards healing and like coming back into community with each other, rather than kind of like, let's put everyone in their box and like everyone will be happy because they're in different boxes, right? Thinking more about community accountability, that is kind of speaking to the need for our communities to think about how we as groups can be complicit in the occurrence of violence in our community, right? So one example is we have this concept that a lot of activists in this space have been working really hard against in the last couple decade or two, is this concept of sexual and domestic violence as a private matter, right? That's something we shouldn't interfere in. It happens in a relationship. It has nothing to do with us. It happens between two individuals. That's an example of how we as a community need to kind of move to an accountability model for our role in violence. So I mentioned before, bystander intervention approaches are one way that we can kind of think about how we collectively create safer spaces and send a message about what kind of behavior is acceptable in our community. But this also concerns a lot of like much broader questions of reframing our beliefs about things like gender roles, about sexual health education, right? What are kids taught about not only consent, but pleasure? Because if we have a pleasure-based approach, then it's much more difficult to kind of mix one up for the other, right? To misunderstand sex as sexual violence. There's a lot of questions for our community about our ideals and the values that we convey that in an accountability model, we have to take responsibility for in a much more engaged way. And then, of course, systemic accountability means taking a hard look at what kind of accountability our systems demand and what accountability they create for themselves. So I already gave the example of, you are more likely to be punished if you hold yourself accountable by pleading guilty in the system, right? There's also ways the systems themselves don't really lean towards accountability. So judges in Canada can largely choose for themselves if and how much they engage in training around the dynamics of sexual and domestic violence, which leads to judges like Robin Camp asking, why didn't you just keep your knees closed, right? This is a way that this system has chosen to avoid accountability for making fair judgments that are grounded in reality and not in myths and individual beliefs of judges, right? That this system has chosen not to be accountable for how it thinks about these concepts by just trusting that judges will figure it out and they won't come in with any biases. So systems that are accountable to themselves are ones that are transparent, ones that can adjust to feedback from their most vulnerable users, and ones whose outcomes are aligned with our collective goals, which means we have to decide whether that collective goal is punishment, whether it's healing, or whether it's something else, right? So kind of accountability requires us to think, what is our orientation to all of these things, and what is the outcome that we're really trying to move towards? Thanks for your note about pleasure, Abby. Yeah, I just finished taking a course on sex positivity, so I'm all about we should be teaching pleasure in every way possible. So on the community and systems sides of things, there's some really valuable frameworks out there, one of which is the transformative justice and community accountability movements. And there's 3 questions that these approaches prompt us to ask that I think are really helpful for us to keep in mind as we think about how differently could we approach this issue. So the first question is, why was harm caused, right? What took place here? Was this an act of entitlement, an act of malice, an act of political violence? Understanding why violence took place rather than litigating exactly what happened, who did what, who said what, lets us take a prevention approach that's not grounded in this individual incident, but rather the conditions that enable it, right? Because the exact conditions of this individual incident, this person was in this room with this person, this had happened, this person was drunk, whatever, are probably not going to emerge again. But the broader conditions of why did this take place will probably emerge all the time, right? And that kind of leads us to this, what conditions allow for violence to exist in cycles, right? Moving the incident up from an individual thing that took place one time to a broader perspective. So in domestic violence, we know that there's a cycle of violence that kind of, tends to circle and become faster over time. Why is the cycle of violence continuing? What resources are missing in our community to intervene in this cycle? What kind of relationships do we need to build or build on to interrupt this cycle? So if we think about the conditions, we can kind of think more broadly than this one individual time. How can we interrupt this, broadly speaking? And finally, what change can we make in our communities that makes survivors feel safe, or that makes everyone feel safe? And this doesn't just mean adding things like we need more streetlights, or we need to be able to test our drinks for substances in them at the bar. It means also what values do we need to upfront to drive that change, right? And also questions about what about the physical layout of our community encourages violence, which I'll come back to in a second because it's just such an interesting point. So that note, I guess, of geography and physical space is taken up really well in this amazing book. I really recommend it, by Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan, Sexual Citizens, which just came out in 2020. So this book is based on, they're sociologists, and they conducted this huge study at Columbia University where they talked to hundreds of students about what their experiences of sex and sexual violence looked like on campus. And it's important to keep in mind that like so many of the studies on sexual violence are done with university students, because obviously they're very easy for researchers to access, and like they're not representative of the whole population, right? What is true for university students is probably not true for undocumented workers from the Philippines. But I think it does help us think like kind of conceptually about the conditions in which sexual violence kind of emerges. And I think that they give us some really useful interventions in how we think about sexual violence in this book. So the argument they make in this book I first want to focus on is something that if you work in sexual violence, if you have come up in this movement like since the 80s, which I have, like this is the perspective I come from, is the movement has worked really hard to differentiate between sex and sexual assault, right? Like it's like a talking point that sexual violence is not sex, right? It is something different. And most of us would probably say that to a client. I would probably have said that to a client. And feminist philosopher Anne Cahill points out that this did a really important piece of work for us for a long time, right? As long as rape remains associated in the common consciousness with other like allegedly consensual sexual encounters, rape victims are assumed to be at least partially responsible for their own victimization, right? So if rape can occur in the context of what is consensual sex, then it is incumbent upon the consenter to maintain the line between the two, right? If we see them happening in the same space, then it's difficult to say one of them is a crime and one of them is like an acceptable thing. So the differentiation was a really important piece for the feminist movement. And obviously, many incidents of sexual violence do have very little to do with sex, right? So the way that sexual violence is used as a weapon of war has very little in common with sex as a consensual experience. But what Hirsch and Kahn found in their conversations with college students was that their experiences of sex and sexual violence, most of the time, the boundary between the two things is not that clear. So lots of students' experiences of sex cross the line into sexual assault because although these students had had affirmative consent drilled into them for years, they didn't really have language to talk with each other about what they wanted, about those pleasure pieces, about different sexual acts, about their comfort, about their intoxication levels, or their mindset towards sex didn't really consider the full right to self-determination of their sexual partners, right? So they were like, I'm here to get some. They're here also. I assume that that's what they want too. They haven't really like thought about what the other person wants. So this can be like a really tricky line to like kind of walk back over if you've been like really grounded in the way that we think about sexual violence in the prevention sphere. But I think to me, the benefit of reopening this space of this hard differentiation between like sex and all sexual violence allows us to engage in a much more helpful conversation. Because if our starting place is not who can we punish, because someone has to be punished for sexual violence, but rather how can we reshape individuals in our communities to stop violence, then we also have to shift the kinds of questions about what we need to be learning to change our interactions to consensual ones, right? So they have this concept of sexual citizenship, and that's what they kind of wrap in there, is like our ability to articulate our own right to sexual self-determination and recognize it in other people, the lack of which they saw was underlying so much of the sexual violence, especially that was happening in the context of people that know each other already, which is most sexual violence. So they kind of suggest that if we can understand that like usually this is happening in the context of sex, where people are not recognizing each other as fully agential human beings, that gives us a different ground to intervene besides like you have to get consent, but rather like, do you know what the other person wants? And how have you talked with that other person about what they want, right? So just like some really interesting provocations there that I think are really useful for us to think about. Their other concept that I kind of want to touch on is this idea of sexual geography, which brings us back to that idea of like, what can we as a community change to make people more safe? So an example from the book that I found was like just a really interesting finding was that the roommate system at colleges pushes people into unsafe sexual situations all the time because people have limited access to a private space in their own control, right? If you share a room with a roommate, like someone has to leave the room for you to have that private space. So like most often that's not going to be available. And usually like higher year older students have access to better housing with more privacy, right? So it's usually the younger people that are on kind of this back foot. If you can never have space on your own turf, you can't control when you can ask someone to leave. You don't have reliable supports or people you know around you. You don't know how to get home, or you might not have the resources to get home. And your ability to say no is diminished in all kinds of really impactful ways that pushes people to stay in situations that they might like recognize as like not ideal, right? And if you are in your own space, but you only have it available for 45 minutes until your roommate comes back from the library, then the pressure to engage in sex in that space is really significantly heightened, right? Like we only have 45 minutes. I guess we better get to it. So this is just like one example of sexual geography that they talk about, but I think it's a really fascinating insight into how, if we think about like what causes sexual violence in a much broader way than like bad person doing bad thing, we can think about how we can change the social and physical conditions of our environment and our societies in really interesting ways. So I won't have time to talk about sexual projects too much today, but also a really interesting outcome. So I really recommend that book if you're interested in this topic. So that kind of brings me, I guess, to another chance for us to just chat a little bit before we wrap up here about what the opportunities we see are in thinking about how we approach sexual violence differently. So I guess the first question I would pose then is like, have you ever seen kind of these opportunities perk up and maybe they're just difficult to seize? Or, you know, if you work in a cross-cultural context, I would imagine that this would probably be true a lot of the time because our Western modes are kind of really grounded in this. Has anyone kind of encountered opportunities to think about this differently? Maybe I'll put up my second question while you're chewing through that, and then we kind of have two opportunities to bounce off of. So Miriam Keba again points out that if tomorrow we, as we are, had to build all new systems, they would probably be oppressive in the same ways that the ones we have today are, because that's how we think, right? That's how we think that these systems have to think. That's our mindset. So my second question, I guess, is what would we have to change about ourselves to do this work differently? So if anyone has thoughts on either of these things or just wants to ask questions generally, that's kind of the end of my material. So I'd love to engage in questions as well.
The only opportunities I've seen talking about sexual violence has always been on a consent-based approach, and like I think it was Abby who pointed out, yes, sexual like as a pleasure point is important to think about, but like how would we change things differently, like about ourselves, like even if it's a new society, we'd always like try to go for order and relationships, but like about ourselves, like accepting when there's a relationship that other people don't want. It's a very hard thing, but I think that's also where entitlement and sexual violence stems from too. Like feeling like, oh, we're being rejected. We have to like show that, there's some way that we should be accepted. And that actually just breeds violence. But yeah, just acceptance too.
Yeah, absolutely. Rejection sensitivity is like a really interesting concept that like people who are talking about how do we build resilience towards that, right? That like we can hear someone say no to us and not experience it as like, oh, I guess I'm a terrible person. Like I need to respond to that somehow, right? Yeah, the way we interact with people really has a lot to do with this. Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Any other thoughts, Abby? In my work, I work with sexual harassment and violence sometimes. It can be so hard when something so personal is challenged by standards of professionalism. Can you expand on that a little bit? Sorry, probably forcing you into a speed typing scenario. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, when we talk about what happens in the workplace, if you're in like an HR kind of position, this need again that there's going to have to be like an arbiter of who was wrong and who was right, and consequences are going to have to be imposed. Kind of forces you to not take this place of compassion, but rather be neutral. That sounds really difficult. And it comes back to this, do we need things to be right, or do we need people to be punished? Our capacity to express solidarity is kind of limited if we need to maintain the neutrality of this system. Absolutely. That sounds really difficult to deal with as a professional. Anything else anyone wants to pop in our last 3 minutes?
I have an idea about as mentioned before, there was sorry, did I cut out? And there was an issue with connection.
No, I can hear you.
Okay. So as previously mentioned, people who are committing sexual violence have been assaulted or something in the past. But like encouraging them to seek help and attend counseling, that kind of thing. A lot of cases it's hard to do with these punitive systems. So it's very interesting to just look at it and get them to see that, this was something wrong and I need to heal. It's a good way to go about it.
Yes, absolutely. In Sexual Citizens, they have a line that I really love about how our body is a canvas, and the things that happen to that canvas like train us for how these things should happen in the future, right? Which I think really speaks to how often, but not always, experiencing sexual violence can be something that trains you to either perpetrate or experience it again in the future, right? There's much higher rates of re-experiencing sexual violence once you've experienced it once, because of all of kind of these, and that's not to blame the people who experience it, but rather that we're like socialized into these roles. We blame ourselves. If we only ever approach these things with a punitive model, then there's no space for relearning something different, right? A different kind of approach to it. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to pop us onto my last slide. I'm just cognizant of time, but it does have a QR code there if you want to scan it. And I can also just pop in the chat the link to the slideshow. So if you're interested in any of these resources, click that.
For sure. Just to let you know, Simone also had a question in there.
Therapy and other forms of institutional support can be incredibly traumatizing or re-traumatizing. So how do we think of people getting help outside of institutions? And I think that's, if we bring it back to this community question, then, right, we can think about how to build spaces of accountability and support that aren't traumatic in that way and can kind of be grounded in people's needs rather than our feeling of the need to like impose a consequence on people. So yes, absolutely. It's so difficult when things are institutionalized like that. Okay, I'm sure we probably need to wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for your listening and participation. It's been really nice to just kind of like talk through these things with everyone, and hopefully it's given you some food for thought to kind of take forward into your future work. And if you want to be in contact with us, SAVE's website is there. And we're always happy to have conversations about this kind of stuff because it's increasingly very important to us. So Thanks very much, everyone.